right. Well, thanks to you all for joining us this hour. Rachel does have the night off, but she will be back tomorrow. But I want to start tonight with the story of Courtney Wild. Here's her picture. She was 14 years old at the time that it was taken and living in Florida. She was in middle school. She was captain of the cheerleading squad and played the trumpet. She got good grades. She had braces. And when she was 14 years old, Courtney was introduced to a man named Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein is a well-connected, incredibly wealthy multimillionaire. He's surrounded himself with powerful, high-profile people. His private airline has hosted high-profile guests like former President Bill Clinton, Britain's Prince Andrew, and various celebrities. And Donald Trump has described him as a friend. In 2005, Florida police started investigating Jeffrey Epstein, and what they turned up was horrifying. Investigators say they found that Jeffrey Epstein was essentially running a criminal operation to molest and, in at least one case, rape large numbers of girls, many of whom were underage. Jeffrey Epstein was in his 50s. Many of his victims were children. The FBI got involved and was able to identify dozens of girls who had been Epstein's victims. Most of them were between 13 and 16 years old. Some people think there could be hundreds of other victims out there. One of Jeffrey Epstein's alleged victims was Courtney Wild, who again was 14 when she met Epstein. She says he sexually abused her for years. Her story was identified by the FBI, spelled out in the Miami Herald's heroic reporting on the story. The FBI then used her account and dozens of others to prepare criminal charges against Jeffrey Epstein for being a serial child sex offender. The indictment the FBI wrote up, the one listing all of Jeffrey Epstein's heinous crimes, it was 53 pages long. 53 pages of stories like Courtney Wild's. The indictment accused Epstein of recruiting underage girls for sex across state lines. Those are federal charges, which could have sent Epstein to prison for the rest of his life. Instead, a federal prosecutor named Alex Acosta prevented Jeffrey Epstein from being charged with any federal crimes, and prevented federal charges against any potential accomplices of Epstein, too. Today, that man, Alex Acosta, is in the president's cabinet. He is Donald Trump's labor secretary. But back when that FBI investigation was going on, he was the U.S. attorney in southern Florida. And instead of charging Jeffrey Epstein with those 53 pages of child sex crimes, Alex Acosta made a deal with him. He allowed Epstein to enter into something called a non-prosecution agreement, which gave him immunity from all federal charges. Instead, he pled guilty to 2 state charges for prostitution, as if the girls like Courtney Wild were prostitutes, not children being victimized by an accused child molester. Thanks to the very sweet deal that he got from Acosta, Epstein served just 13 months in a county jail. He even got to leave jail during the days to work in his office. Since then, Jeffrey Epstein has gone back to living off his millions, jet-setting all over the world. As for Alex Acosta, he agreed to do his special deal for Jeffrey Epstein in secret. Federal law gives crime victims the right to be told when there are plea negotiations going on in their case. But Alex Acosta did not notify Jeffrey Epstein's victims before he granted him that plea deal. Epstein's lawyers asked Acosta to keep the deal a secret, and Acosta agreed. And so Courtney Wild, one of Epstein's victims, who was kept in the dark about that deal, she sued the government, alleging that Alex Acosta and his team of prosecutors broke the law by keeping secret from her and all the other victims the fact that they gave Epstein this non-prosecution deal. She filed that lawsuit 11 years ago. It dragged on for more than a decade. In the meantime, Courtney Wild bravely and courageously put her name on the record and told her story about Jeffrey Epstein to the Miami Herald. And Courtney Wild did not give up. She did not drop her case after all that time. Eventually, earlier this year, a federal judge agreed with her, ruling that the current Secretary of Labor, Alex Acosta, broke the law when he agreed to keep that deal with Jeffrey Epstein a secret from his victims. And yet still, even then, there was no justice for Courtney Wild and her fellow victims. Alex Acosta stayed labor secretary. Jeffrey Epstein stayed free. Jeffrey Epstein could not be held accountable for his alleged crimes toward Courtney Wild and those dozens of other women like her with that non-prosecution agreement still on the books in Florida. Over the weekend, federal prosecutors in New York City busted down the door of Jeffrey Epstein's Manhattan mansion and arrested him at the airport after he landed in his private jet fresh off a vacation in France. This morning, Jeffrey Epstein was arraigned in federal court on federal sex trafficking charges in the state of New York. In this new indictment, prosecutors allege that between the years of 2002 and 2005, Epstein abused dozens of underage girls at his homes in Manhattan and in Palm Beach. The allegations are practically a mirror image of the allegations written up against Epstein more than a decade ago in Florida, the ones that were shelved by Alex Acosta. They cover the same period, the same kinds of lurid sex crimes against children. But they are new charges about different allegations from the last time that he was investigated in Florida. The ones covered by that non-prosecution agreement, which has been protecting Epstein from being charged there. But that agreement not to prosecute him, that's only valid in southern Florida, where Acosta made the deal, which left the field wide open for prosecutors in New York to conduct an investigation of their own into Epstein's conduct in New York, in their own backyard, which led to these brand new charges today. And this time, prosecutors in New York do not think Epstein should be set free with just a slap on the wrist. Under this new indictment, Epstein faces 45 years in prison. Now, he's 66 years old, which means that if he's found guilty in New York, Epstein could spend the rest of his natural life behind bars. And prosecutors seem to think they have enough evidence to put him there. Today, investigators announced what they found when they busted through Epstein's front door: documents, notes, messages, including names and contact information for Epstein's alleged victims, as well as call records confirming Epstein's contact with them, with the victims. Prosecutors say that all that evidence is, quote, consistent with victim recollections, further strengthening the evidence of the conduct charged in the indictment. Prosecutors also say they found hundreds, if not thousands, of lewd photographs of young women and girls without their clothes on, many of whom are believed to be underage. Some of those photos were discovered in a locked safe. Prosecutors writing today, quote, the defendant is not reformed. He is not chastened. He is not repentant. Rather, he is a continuing danger to the community and an individual who faces devastating evidence supporting deeply serious charges. And that devastating evidence, prosecutors say, that they have against Jeffrey Epstein, that must be relief to women like Courtney Wild, relief to the dozens, maybe hundreds of Epstein's victims just like her, who lost their shot at justice the first time around because Alex Acosta took that shot away. But it's potentially devastating news for the president's labor secretary, too. Since Alex Acosta gave that sweetheart deal when he was U.S. attorney, he has defended his handling of the case. Now, he says without that deal, Epstein could have gotten zero jail time, zero registration as a sexual offender, and that there would have been zero restitution for the victims in this case. He said that what he did was the best that he could get based on the evidence that he had. But with this new indictment, prosecutors in New York seem to directly contradict that assertion, because according to this new indictment, there is enough evidence documenting Epstein's child sex crimes to put him in jail for the rest of his life. Alex Acosta, for whatever reason, did not see it that way. Joining us now is Julie Brown, the Miami Herald investigative reporter, whose in-depth reporting series on Jeffrey Epstein not only broke this story wide open last year, but was today credited by prosecutors with assisting in the investigation. She was inside the court today. Julie, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
First of all, thank you for doing this reporting. And for these young victims, it had to have been a relief to finally see, at least the beginnings of what could be justice. Does it surprise you that the charges that are being brought against him today are so similar to the charges that he was given a sweet deal for before? And how can that be explained to sort of the ordinary person out there?
Well, he had an operation going. He had people who worked for him. He had a whole setup of recruiters all over in New York, in Florida. As far as we know, this was probably going on in the U.S. Virgin Islands, where he also had a home, and in Europe. And he had schedulers, just like an organized crime organization operates, with a boss at the top, and you have the lieutenants, and you have capos, and you have soldiers. He had, pilots and schedulers and recruiters and people who handled his money, and paid the girls, people who, valets who drove the girls back and forth. He had a schedule where 2, 3 of them would come every single day. So it wouldn't be surprising that since he had the same organization in place, that same kind of operation existed in New York as well as in Florida.
And how publicly known, I mean, among the people who knew Jeffrey Epstein, was this something that was known, that this was something that he was doing, or was this a secret operation where, as you said, the employees knew, but outside of that group of people, no one knew?
Well, there were people outside the operation that probably knew that what he was doing. Whether they participated in it, just knew about it and looked the other way, we don't know for sure. Yeah. But there were certainly a number of people that had to know what he was doing because it was just too pervasive for them not to know.
And how was it that the first time that he was sentenced and he got this deal, I mean, the idea that he was even allowed to be out of jail on sort of a work release program, I mean, he was barely punished at all. And why, and the girls were classified as, well, I mean, what he was convicted of was prostitution.
Right, right. Well, I think that they treated these girls like they were prostitutes, even though they were underage. I think that that's one of the excuses that they gave for not charging him with more serious crimes because they accepted money. It was somehow, their fault in their minds that these girls, they came from vulnerable families, broken homes. Some of them were really pretty much homeless. And so they didn't take these girls seriously, which in hindsight they probably should have, because a couple of them actually took them to court and have been fighting for this for 10 years. And they have been pretty persistent in fighting for justice.
How well did Jeffrey Epstein know Donald Trump? When Donald Trump calls him a friend, is that accurate reflection of their relationship?
I think that they were friends, yes. I don't know if they still are, but he flew on Jeffrey's plane. They were neighbors in Palm Beach. Jeffrey at one time belonged to Mar-a-Lago. The rumor is that Trump actually kicked him out of Mar-a-Lago because he had hit on one of the members' younger daughters. So I don't know how friendly they are any longer, but at one point, yes, they were in the same social circle.
And have you been able to interview or talk to people who were in the U.S. Attorney's Office with Alex Acosta that had any thoughts about the way that he ended this case?
Well, Jeff Sloman, who was his deputy, has been very vocal in his support of Mr. Acosta. He agrees that Alex Acosta did everything that he could, that he faced a lot of pushback by Epstein's attorneys, that in their view anyway, that the girls at the time were reluctant to, go to trial because they were scared. They were very young, 13, 14 years old. Yeah. But here's what, I always point out to people is that if this was such a good deal, if this was the right thing to do, why did you seal it and keep it secret? I don't understand why anybody hasn't forced him to answer that question. Yeah. They always say, well, the girls didn't want to cooperate and, their stories were different or there was all these, other reasons. But okay, but then why did you seal it and then make them fight for almost a year? The government fought them, wouldn't even give them the agreement. So, it's baffling that they could justify this by saying, all these reasons, but in reality, the real reason is that they kept it from him. Yeah, well, it would have been nice maybe to ask him those questions during his confirmation hearing. Maybe we could have gotten some answers. I'm Herald investigative reporter Julie Brown. Thank you very much for your time tonight. Congratulations on the wonderful reporting. Thank you. Thank you.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.